Thanks, Emily, and thanks so much for having this conversation with us, Representative. As we mark 50 years of Title IX, it feels especially important to discuss how far gender equality has come, especially given you've been a trailblazer both in higher education and in your state. Now, I want to start by asking you about your experience at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. And I have to say that I am personally very excited to be talking to the first woman to have graduated from this military college because my own mother actually was a math professor there a few years before your time. So she was able to teach Shannon Faulkner, who, as I'm sure you know, was the first woman to enroll, though she did not end up graduating. So I would love to hear about your time there. What brought you there? What was it like being one of the first women in that space?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I graduated there, I guess, 20 years ago in the summer of 1999. It's kind of amazing when I look back. And I just went to a graduation for one of my family members a few weeks ago. I hadn't been back to graduation in a really long time, but my father is a graduate of the Citadel. And so it was all male, for 154 years before women were able to apply and be accepted and enroll and graduate from there. But I'm a product of a military family. Most of my family has served in the military, but most of the graduates of the Citadel don't eventually go in the military. We have about a third that do that. But I stumbled on some really hard times in my life when I was young and I was growing up. I was raped when I was 16, and I dropped out of high school on my 17th birthday. And my parents had said to me, if you're going to stop going to school, you got to start going to work. And I learned some really tough lessons during some extraordinarily tough times in my life. And during that time, I learned about the value of hard work. And I was a waitress at a Waffle House, believe it or not. And I used to stand on a piece of duct tape about a foot wide, and I would yell at the cooks in the back how my customers wanted their hash browns. And I would, order and serve food to my customers at all times of day. And so, I'm really proud of where I got my start, and it shows how far you can go. Even as I dropped out of school, learning the value of second chances, learning the value of hard work, and figuring out, how to get my life back in order, how to get it back together after going through so much pain and trauma, emotionally, physically, and mentally. And it was during that time, the principal of my high school was a graduate of the Citadel. So there's this recurring theme of Citadel grads in my life. And he allowed me to take college courses when I was in high school at a local community college. So when I was at night or on the weekends taking courses at a local college, community college, and I was able to get my high school diploma in about 6 months. And I technically graduated high school a year early at the age of 17. And this was in 1995. And then 1996, a year later, there was a Supreme Court case against the Virginia Military Institute, or VMI, that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion on, and said if your college or university received any government funding, you couldn't discriminate based on gender. And that was a huge decision, which seems perfectly normal, but actually back then in the mid-90s, it was very controversial. And that was in 1996 when she rendered that decision. And 2 days later, the Citadel decided to let women in. They weren't going to fight, not keeping them out for any longer. And I applied within 24 hours. As soon as they made that decision, I went down to the campus and picked up my application and turned it in. And I went to the Citadel. It wasn't for me to break a glass ceiling. It wasn't to be the first woman. In fact, I don't really consider myself much of a feminist, right? I'm just someone that wants to do what everybody else can do. I want to be able to do whatever any man can do, right? We should have that right to be able to do that. And if we work hard, we set goals, we have ambition, we can achieve, we can be successful. And so when that happened, it really changed my life. And I went there not to be the first, but I went there because I had something to prove to myself as a woman who was raped at the age of 16. I had something to prove to my family and to my parents. I could go to a place that I could be challenged, that I could face adversity, and that I could face an obstacle like anything I'd faced in my life, and I wouldn't quit. Like I quit school, and I would be successful, and I would achieve something. And I learned a lot of valuable lessons going through a very difficult experience like that, but I loved every minute of it too.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned challenges. Can you elaborate on what kinds of challenges you faced at the Citadel?
Well, certainly when you're breaking a glass ceiling, there's all sorts of things. I had people threatening to shoot me, I had people threatening to shoot my family. I learned about sexual harassment and what that was, and the kind of words that people will sometimes use when they are harassing you. And there was a bomb threat even at my graduation. And to think that is the experience that I went through as an 18-year-old is really remarkable. And today, as a member of Congress, I still get those same threats because it's a very divisive time politically. And I sometimes joke, it was a serious time that I was trained for this. I was built for this. I was built for tough. But I learned about having courage facing those challenging moments. And I learned about what it took to have a voice and using that voice, no matter what the repercussions were, no matter the consequences, having a voice and using it and giving a voice to those who don't have one, giving a voice to the voiceless. And I also learned not only about courage, but then I learned through those challenges about confidence, because if we don't believe in ourselves, then no one's going to believe in us. And that's true when you're a woman in the boardroom or in business or a CEO or at work day to day. That's true when you're starting a company. It's true when you're running for office. It's true when you're trying to legislate and create laws and get laws signed into get a bill signed into law. It's true when I'm putting my kids to bed at night, hopefully at 9 o'clock tonight on a school night. But also in that all male environment, when there are just a handful of women there, I learned about what women do to other women. And most of the time, we don't support one another. And I had an experience when I was in my second year. I was a sophomore cadet at the Citadel. And I remember I was a lot tougher on the other women that were coming behind me than I was on the men. And I recognized this in myself. And then when I got my first job at a consulting firm, my first boss was a woman. And I remember my female colleagues and I saying, man, isn't she treating us differently or tougher on us than she is on our male colleagues who are doing the same job with the same pay and everything else? And that was a really valuable experience. You see it all the time. You see it in politics, you see it in business, you see it at the workplace, you see it in your communities and in your neighborhoods, that we just do this a lot of times. And that doesn't help us achieve our dreams. That doesn't help us achieve our goals. That does not help us become more successful. And in some cases, it makes it tougher for other women who want to continue to break barriers, who want to continue to break glass ceilings. It makes it tougher on those women too, in trying to set a good example for the women that are going to come behind them. So those are really valuable lessons to learn in that environment.
Right, right. Absolutely. And you mentioned that you have been back, recently went to a graduation. From your perspective, when it comes to discrimination in federally funded educational programs, what progress has been made from what you can see, and what more could or should be done?
You have leadership within our college campuses that are to ensure that everyone is treated fairly, that they're treated equally, and that there are reporting mechanisms for when there are incidents. But there are still issues on college campuses. For example, in one of the colleges in my backyard, in my congressional district, there was a few students a few years ago that were trying to create a nonpartisan political organization, and the campus barred them from creating it. And they had to sue to create a nonpartisan political group on campus, because there's this thing called free speech. And by the Constitution, as a student, you should be able to exercise that speech anywhere. And so you do see from time to time issues on campus. But in our case, we had leadership within the school where incidents could be reported or investigated. And there was that reporting mechanism. And then you could report individuals within the Citadel. In the cadet leadership, you could report someone if there were inappropriate behavior or inappropriate treatment or something that was unfair and not equal. It's really important to learn the value of being able to speak up and to speak for yourself, and to have that kind of courage, which is not easy, particularly when you're young or you're in school, you're in college. But it's really important for folks to step up regardless of the consequences, to make those experiences known, to make those experiences heard, to share those experiences so that we may then learn from them and better improve systems that are in place for those that may be experiencing some of those challenges.
Mhm. And can you speak to how culture of a school, culture of a campus plays into some of these challenges, and whether you've seen changes when it comes to culture?
Yeah, I mean, certainly every campus is different. You've got public schools, you've got private schools, you have schools that focus on engineering, or you have schools that focus on the liberal arts, or medical schools, et cetera. So really every environment is different. I do believe that our colleges today are doing their best job when they can to ensure an equal and level playing field for everybody, regardless of their zip code, the color of skin, their gender, where they're coming from, the amount of money they make or their families make coming into that. And you've seen that progress over the years. And in some cases, when you have a school that isn't, there ought to be repercussions for it, even financially. Like I'm a big supporter of, hey, if that school isn't doing the right thing or behaving in the right manner, then you withhold some of their government funding. There are ways to institute incentives to ensure that schools do the right things. As I said earlier, these students had a First Amendment right, and that was just maybe 4 or 5 years ago that happened. It's pretty recent. That's why it's really important for students to speak up and to have a voice and to organize. In fact, we had a hearing on the oversight committee, and we had some students come in and testify, and it was about curriculum in schools, and they were all witnesses for the other side of the aisle, which was fine. But to listen to these students and the way that they organize on their campuses was pretty amazing. So students today have far better tools to organize. That's through social media, that's through apps, to organize and have their voices heard, to get meetings with the president of colleges, to get that information out there, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on or what issue you're working on. You have a voice and you have the tools and the resources, most of the time free, to utilize that voice. And I would encourage students to continue doing that. There's some really remarkable examples of students on both sides of the aisle having their voices heard because of the advance in technology, the apps that we have to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a bit about your political career. You are the first Republican woman to be elected to Congress from South Carolina. And so I just want to hear a little bit about what brought you to politics, what made you decide to pursue that.
Well, when I was 18, I started voting in general elections and presidential elections. I've been voting since I was young, since I had the right to vote. And I would encourage everyone who's 18 or older, if you're not registered, get registered and vote and have your voice heard. But I really wasn't involved in politics until I was an adult and I was in my 30s. I didn't really know a whole lot about it. I knew you voted in presidential elections, but I didn't know really much more beyond that. But in 2008, I was a young mom. I had a 2-year-old and I was pregnant with my second child, and I wanted to stay at home, but I also wanted to work. And so I had this challenge before me. And so I started my own business, and I was able to work from home in my business. And one of my first clients, it was in 2010. I started my company in 2008. And in 2010, I got my first political client. I was doing technology and PR and marketing for business to business sort of clients. But I met now Senator Tim Scott. I met Mick Mulvaney, who was a congressman from South Carolina. I met Tom Rice, who I serve with in the House now in Congress as well. But I took on my first political clients, and I was doing some technology for them, like building websites and doing some communications work for their campaigns. And I was just so inspired by their leadership and what they were doing and the work that they did. It was really impressive. And in particular, the way that they operated, they're all three really extraordinary leaders. And Tim Scott's story is remarkable if you've not heard it. And the only Black Republican in the United States Senate. And we come from the same cloth. We both had challenges growing up, and now we're both elected officials within the state of South Carolina. In fact, I represent his congressional district, the first congressional district. But I took on a couple of political clients, and I loved every minute of it. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I ran for the US Senate in my mid-30s in 2014, not a few years after that. I lost. It was terrible. And I said, oh, I'm never going to do this again. But then in 2017, there was a special election. My own state House rep had to resign. And in a special election in South Carolina was about 10 weeks. And I was like, well, I can do anything for 10 weeks. And I ran and I won, and I became really effective at it, and I loved it. It gave me purpose in life. It drives who I am. And I've had a lot of successes. And in fact, in my first 3 years in office as a state lawmaker, I had a bill signed into law, which is very rare for anyone, let alone someone who's pretty new at the job. And that was a prison reform bill. I do a lot of work on civil rights. And it was a civil rights type of legislation that a Republican governor signed into law. And it was a conservative bill. And so Now today in Congress, I ran for the seat and I flipped it from Democrat to Republican in November of 2020. I'm the highest ranking Republican on a committee, on the Oversight Committee, and it's the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Committee. And so I'm pursuing a body of work that I started as a state lawmaker, and that's really important to my district and really important to me personally. And it's sort of ironic now looking back at my life as someone who's broken glass barriers, broken glass ceilings, as the first woman to graduate from the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, and as the first Republican woman from the state of South Carolina to ever be elected to Congress. That work on civil rights is really important, and that we continue that work, and that we have Republicans at the table leading on that civil rights work.
Mhm. Wow, that's an incredible story.
Mhm.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So I want to get to this last question. How have your experiences and challenges you've experienced being the first in many spaces, how has that informed your political work today and your vision for the future?
Well, I never thought I would be where I am today. I didn't think that a high school dropout could ever make it to Congress. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and serving is an honor. I want to show an example that if you have a dream and you set your goals and you work hard, you can achieve it. And when I look back at my life, I've had as many failures as I have had successes. I've had second chance after second chance after second chance. And so I don't take anything for granted. And in fact, politically, politicians really frustrate me. I get really pissed off sometimes because people run for office and they say they're going to do one thing, they get elected and they do another. And we just need
Right.
good people doing good things. I mean, people actually doing the work. And as a conservative, I represent a swing district. I represent not just conservatives. So for me, it's really important that I find common ground, and to find common ground, sometimes you have to find common sense. And so I am informed by the values of my district, which are very diverse. But in doing so, as a conservative in a Congress where we don't have a majority, that if you work hard and you find that common ground, you can be successful. I have passed 16 bills out of committee. I have passed 4 bills out of the floor of the House. And now I have a leadership role on the Oversight Committee within civil rights, the civil rights space. I'm doing something that I never thought I would be doing. And when you look back at my life, and you can consider going to the Citadel and graduating from there as the first woman, being a civil rights sort of issue, and understanding what that means, and how to continue that body of work. And now I have an opportunity to do that. It's really exciting. But I know that if you work hard, you can deliver. And there are a number of different issues that are facing our country. We've had crisis after crisis after crisis, whether we're talking about the border issue, or we're talking about Afghanistan, or we're talking about Ukraine. I've been to the border of Ukraine. Where we're talking about Taiwan. I've been to Taiwan. I met with the president. Or inflation and the cost of goods and what goes into it. In fact, I was talking this morning about diesel fuel and how there's going to be a shortage of that in the not too distant future, and what that's going to mean for produce and going to the grocery store, and how that's going to increase the cost of food. And so, understanding that where I came from informs my work today, because you got to work hard to be successful, and anybody can do it. But that one piece allows you to do that. And I know that we can find common ground. And we've had a devastating and traumatic and horrific events. I was dropping my kids off at school yesterday morning, and there are 19 families in Uvalde that didn't get the opportunity to do that because their kids were murdered. And there's going to be a lot of controversy on that particular issue. How do we keep our students and our kids and our communities and our campuses safe? And I'm looking at the work that I've done in Congress, and I'm looking at the work I did as a state lawmaker. There is common ground, and there is common sense, and there is a way to work together that would unite us rather than divide us. And it's really up to us as Americans to say, time out, stop with the bullshit, stop with the tweets, and what are the ways that we can work together that are constitutionally sound, that don't infringe on anyone's rights, that will actually save lives. And so we've got to take on the toughest of challenges that we have, and we've got to be able to raise our hand and say, let's work together. And that's one of the things I'm most proud about, the ability to be able to raise my hand and put it all out there, take the risk, which means, hey, I've got folks coming after me in my election because of those risks, but that is the right thing to do. And I'm a single working mom, and I know that my kids and my country are worth that much at a minimum because of the challenges that we face today. And so my life experiences have informed that it's always right to do what is right. I think that was Martin Luther King that said that. And that's what we all should be doing, no matter what our political affiliation or our party politics are. And that's what I aim to continue doing as long as the voters will allow me to do it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to tell your story and to chat. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marielle. And look forward to chatting to you guys, with you guys soon again.